The city of Coldwater was gripped by the harshest winter in decades. Snow blanketed the streets in heavy layers, ice glazed over every surface, and the wind howled relentlessly through the urban canyons of high-rises and narrow alleys. The temperature had plummeted well below freezing, forcing most residents to seek the sanctuary of their homes. It was the kind of cold that penetrated even the thickest of coats and made every breath sting. On this unforgiving evening, Maria Hendricks, a distinguished architect in her late 30s, walked briskly along the dimly lit streets, clutching a bag of groceries in one hand and the edge of her coat tightly around her with the other. Her dark, confident eyes scanned her surroundings, not out of fear, but with the careful awareness of someone who knew the weight of her presence in this neighborhood. Maria wasn't just an ordinary resident. She had spent the better part of a decade working on urban development projects that aimed to uplift struggling communities. But tonight she wasn't thinking about blueprints or city council meetings. She had just returned from an intense overseas project and was looking forward to the quiet of her apartment, a reprieve from both the biting cold and the chaos of her work. The streets were nearly empty, the usual hum of the city muffled by the thick snow. The occasional car passed, headlights casting fleeting beams of light across the otherwise shadowy road. She adjusted the strap of her bag, her fingers beginning to numb despite her gloves. She quickened her pace. Across the street, a patrol car idled with its lights off, its silhouette blending into the backdrop of darkened buildings and snow-covered sidewalks. Inside sat Officer Kevin Hartley, a man in his mid-40s with a reputation that preceded him. He was known for his volatile temper and an uncanny ability to escalate even the most mundane situations. Hartley had been patrolling this district for years, but he hadn't earned a name for himself through acts of heroism or service. Instead, his career was marked by a series of complaints, mostly from minorities, alleging unnecessary use of force, verbal abuse, and racial profiling. Though none of the complaints had ever led to disciplinary action, his behavior had made him a polarizing figure among his colleagues. To some, he was a dedicated officer trying to clean up the streets. To others, he was a walking liability, the kind of cop who embodied everything wrong with law enforcement. Hartley sat hunched over in his seat, gripping the steering wheel as he stared out the frosted windshield. The day had been uneventful, and it left him stewing in his own frustration. He hated the cold, hated the quiet, and most of all, hated feeling invisible in a city where he believed his authority should demand respect. Then his eyes caught movement. A lone figure walking down the opposite side of the street. He straightened up, narrowing his eyes as he focused on Maria's silhouette. To him, she didn't look like she belonged. Her confident stride and polished appearance clashed with the rough edges of this part of town. In his mind, that was reason enough to investigate. Hartley turned on his headlights, the sudden brightness cutting through the dark and illuminating Maria's path. She squinted against the glare, momentarily disoriented, but continuing her walk. Hartley's pulse quickened as he reached for his radio, but then stopped himself. He didn't need backup for this. It was routine, he told himself, just another check. He turned the key and the engine roared to life, shattering the silence of the street. Maria glanced over her shoulder as the car pulled out from the curb and began to follow her. The tension in her shoulders tightened, but she kept her pace steady, unwilling to show any sign of unease. The patrol car accelerated slightly, pulling up beside her as Hartley rolled down his window. "Hey, you there?" His voice was sharp, cutting through the cold air. Maria slowed her steps and turned to face him, her breath visible in the freezing night. She didn't flinch under his scrutiny, though her heart beat faster. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked evenly, her tone calm but firm. Hartley eyed her suspiciously, his gaze lingering on her grocery bag and then her face. "What are you doing out here?" he demanded, as if her very presence required justification. Maria's jaw tightened, but she maintained her composure. "I live nearby," she replied, "just heading home from the store." Hartley's eyes narrowed. He didn't like her tone, not defiant, but not deferential either. He was used to people scrambling to explain themselves, to prove they weren't doing anything wrong. Maria's calm demeanor grated on him, stoking the embers of his irritation. "This isn't exactly the kind of neighborhood for late-night strolls," he said, his voice laced with insinuation. Maria raised an eyebrow. "I wasn't aware walking home was a crime," she said, her words measured but pointed. Hartley's grip on the steering wheel tightened. He hated being challenged, especially by someone like her, someone who didn't look like she feared him. He parked the car abruptly and stepped out, his boots crunching against the snow as he approached her. The cold wind bit at his face, but his anger kept him warm. "Let me see some ID," he said, his tone now more of a command than a request. Maria hesitated for a moment, her instincts telling her that this was more than just a routine stop. "I don't see why that's necessary," she said, meeting his gaze. Hartley's patience snapped. "I'm not asking," he barked. "This is a high-crime area, and you're acting suspicious. Now hand it over." Maria felt a surge of anger rise in her chest, but she forced it down. She couldn't afford to escalate the situation. Slowly, she reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her wallet, extracting her driver's license. Hartley snatched it from her hand, his eyes scanning the card. "Maria Hendricks," he read aloud, his tone dripping with disdain. "What do you do for a living, Maria?" "I'm an architect," she replied, her voice steady. Hartley chuckled dryly, as if the very idea amused him. "An architect, huh? And what's an architect doing walking around here at this hour?" Maria exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the icy air. "Like I said, I'm heading home. Is there anything else, officer?" Hartley stared at her, his jaw tightening. He didn't find anything suspicious in her ID, but his mind was already made up. To him, she was a problem, a challenge to his authority that needed to be dealt with. "Stay right here," he said abruptly, turning back toward his car. He opened the door and rummaged through his belongings before emerging with a bottle of water. Maria watched, puzzled as he approached her again. Without warning, Hartley unscrewed the cap and poured the ice-cold water over her head, the liquid instantly soaking through her hat and coat. Maria gasped as the freezing water hit her skin, her body recoiling from the shock. "That'll cool you off," Hartley sneered, a twisted grin spreading across his face. Maria stood frozen for a moment, her breath coming in sharp gasps as the icy water seeped into her clothes. She clenched her fists, fighting the urge to retaliate. Instead, she straightened her posture, lifting her chin as she met Hartley's gaze with unwavering defiance. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life," she said, her voice low but filled with conviction. Hartley's smirk faltered for a split second, but he quickly recovered, masking his unease with bravado. "We'll see about that," he said, turning back toward his car. But as Maria watched him retreat, she knew this encounter was far from over. Maria stood in the freezing cold, her clothes soaked and clinging to her skin, but her mind was razor-sharp, already calculating her next move. The icy water Hartley had poured over her was still dripping from the ends of her coat, pooling in small frozen puddles on the ground. Her body trembled from the shock of the cold, but her resolve was unshaken. The smirk on Hartley's face as he returned to his patrol car was the last straw. Maria knew she couldn't let this go unanswered. This wasn't just an act of humiliation, it was an abuse of power, a line that should never have been crossed. And Maria, a woman who had built her career on methodical problem-solving, wasn't about to let Hartley walk away without consequences. As she stood in the middle of the desolate street, Maria reached into the side pocket of her coat, her fingers trembling, not from fear, but from the biting cold and a simmering anger she kept tightly controlled. She pulled out her phone, the screen lighting up as she quickly navigated to a secure contact. This wasn't just an ordinary call, Maria wasn't an ordinary person, and while Hartley saw her as an easy target, he had no idea who he was dealing with. Pressing the phone to her ear, she spoke calmly but with an edge of urgency. "It's Maria Hendricks. Activate the protocol. Yes, right now." Her tone was professional and authoritative, carrying the weight of someone who knew the power of her words. On the other end, the voice was quick to respond, asking for her location. Maria gave it without hesitation, her eyes locking on Hartley, who seemed oblivious as he fiddled with paperwork in his car. She ended the call with a clipped, "You'll want to hurry." Hartley, having returned to his patrol car, hadn't yet realized the gravity of the situation he had just set in motion. He leaned against the side of the vehicle, casually flipping through a notebook, as if his actions moments ago were of no more consequence than brushing snow off his windshield. He didn't expect any pushback. In his mind, this was just another routine encounter where he could assert his dominance, another night where he could wield his badge like a weapon against someone he deemed unworthy of respect. To him, Maria was nobody, just another face in the wrong place at the wrong time. And yet, despite her composed demeanor, something about her lingered in the back of his mind. It was the way she spoke, the way she didn't falter under his aggression. It gnawed at him, a small voice he ignored in favor of his own ego. Meanwhile, Maria remained rooted to the spot, standing tall despite her drenched and freezing state. The icy air cut through her like knives, but she refused to move, refused to show any sign of weakness. Her breathing slowed as she steadied herself, focusing on the inevitability of what was to come. She didn't just feel anger, she felt vindication, knowing Hartley had no idea how badly he had miscalculated. The minutes dragged on, the oppressive quiet of the street punctuated only by the occasional gust of wind and the faint sound of traffic in the distance. Hartley finally looked up, annoyed by her continued presence. "Are you waiting for something?" he called out, his tone dripping with condescension. He approached her again, clearly irritated by her lack of retreat. "I thought I told you to move along," he snapped, his eyes narrowing as he towered over her. Maria met his gaze with calm defiance, her voice steady as she replied, "You'll regret asking me that." Hartley chuckled bitterly, shaking his head. "Regret? Lady, I don't regret doing my job." He stepped closer, his posture aggressive, trying to intimidate her further. "What's your plan, huh? You gonna file a complaint? Good luck with that. Let me guess, you think someone's actually going to believe you over me?" His words hung in the air like a challenge, but Maria didn't rise to his bait. Instead, she glanced down the street, her focus shifting to the distant hum of an approaching vehicle. Hartley, noticing her gaze, turned to look, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. The street remained as empty and desolate as before. Still, her calm confidence unnerved him, even if he wouldn't admit it. Before he could speak again, the sound of tires crunching against the snow grew louder, drawing both their attention. A sleek black SUV rounded the corner, its headlights cutting through the darkness. It was an unmarked vehicle, its tinted windows betraying no hint of who or what was inside. Hartley frowned, his grip tightening on the belt of his uniform. He didn't like surprises, and this certainly felt like one. The SUV came to a stop a short distance away, its engine rumbling softly. The driver's side door opened, and out stepped a man dressed in a sharp overcoat, his movements deliberate and composed. He exuded authority, the kind that didn't require loud commands or aggressive posturing. As he approached, another man exited the passenger side, similarly dressed, both of them cutting an imposing figure against the snow-covered backdrop. Hartley's confidence wavered for the first time as the men approached. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion. The first man reached into his coat and produced a badge, holding it up for Hartley to see. "Special Agent Brooks, Department of Internal Affairs," he said, his tone clipped and professional. "We received a call regarding misconduct involving Officer Kevin Hartley. That would be you, correct?" Hartley's face hardened, his jaw clenching as he processed the situation. "Misconduct," he repeated, his voice defensive. "I don't know what you're talking about. I was conducting routine patrol." Maria interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests. "Pouring ice water on a civilian and physically intimidating them isn't routine patrol," she said, her tone as sharp as the cold air around them. Hartley's head snapped toward her, his expression shifting from disbelief to anger. "This is ridiculous," he spat, turning back to the agents. "She's just trying to cause trouble. I did nothing wrong." Agent Brooks raised an eyebrow, his gaze unflinching. "We'll be the judge of that. Step away from the woman, Officer Hartley." Hartley hesitated, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment it seemed as though he might argue further, but the weight of the situation finally began to sink in. Reluctantly, he stepped back, his movements stiff and begrudging. Brooks turned to Maria, his expression softening slightly. "Ms. Hendricks, are you all right?" Maria nodded, though the tremble in her hands betrayed the toll the encounter had taken. "I'm fine," she said, her voice steady despite the cold. "But I want this addressed immediately." He crossed a line tonight. Brooks nodded, his professionalism unwavering. "We're here to ensure that happens. This won't go unpunished." Hartley's face burned with humiliation and anger as he stood off to the side, forced to watch as the agents began documenting the incident. For the first time, the power he had wielded so carelessly was stripped away, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. Maria, meanwhile, stood firm, knowing that justice was finally in motion. As the sharp wind bit through the cold night, Maria stood firm, soaked to the skin, watching Officer Hartley shuffle uneasily as the two internal affairs agents methodically began documenting the scene. Her body trembled, though not just from the freezing temperature. Her adrenaline spiked as the tension around her thickened. She couldn't believe the audacity of what had transpired, but she wasn't shocked. Men like Hartley were predictable in their cruelty. Still, she knew this wasn't the time to relax. The battle had only begun. Special Agent Brooks turned his attention to Hartley, his face expressionless, but his words carrying the weight of authority. "Officer Hartley, remain where you are. We'll be conducting an immediate inquiry into the events of tonight." Hartley's face flushed red. An inquiry? His voice cracked slightly, though he quickly tried to mask his unease. "Are you serious? This woman's just trying to stir up trouble. I was doing my job." Brooks raised a hand, silencing him with a single motion. "Enough. This isn't the time for explanations. You'll have your chance to speak, but right now we're focused on collecting evidence." The other agent, a quiet but observant man named Simmons, moved toward Hartley's patrol car. His flashlight beamed through the vehicle's windows as he began a visual inspection. Hartley stiffened, his hand twitching toward his belt as though he were contemplating intervening. Brooks noticed the movement and stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. "Officer Hartley," he said, his tone colder than the night air, "if you interfere with this investigation in any way, you'll be facing immediate suspension. Do you understand?" Hartley gritted his teeth, his jaw clenching visibly. "Fine," he spat, crossing his arms, but his eyes darted nervously between Simmons and the patrol car, betraying his inner turmoil. Maria watched silently, her sharp gaze catching every detail. She could see Hartley's discomfort growing, his bluster cracking under the weight of the agent's presence. Simmons opened the door of the patrol car and leaned in, his flashlight illuminating the interior. "Officer Hartley," he called out, his voice calm but firm, "can you explain why there's an opened bottle of water in your passenger seat? It seems consistent with the liquid that was poured on Ms. Hendricks." Hartley froze for a moment, his brain scrambling for an explanation. "I was thirsty," he blurted out, the excuse tumbling out of his mouth clumsily. "I was drinking it earlier, that's all." Brooks raised an eyebrow, his skepticism evident. "You were drinking water," he repeated, his voice flat. "And then somehow it ended up all over Ms. Hendricks. Care to explain the coincidence?" Hartley's face darkened, and his tone grew defensive. "She was being uncooperative, okay? I thought pouring water might get her attention, snap her out of whatever attitude she had going on." The admission hung in the air like a slap. Simmons straightened, his flashlight lowering as he turned to face Hartley. "So you admit to intentionally pouring water on her," Simmons said evenly, his calm demeanor only heightening the weight of his words. Hartley realized his mistake immediately, but it was too late to backtrack. "I didn't mean it like that," he snapped, his voice rising. "She was acting suspicious, and I was trying to de-escalate the situation." Maria couldn't hold back a bitter laugh. "De-escalate? By dumping freezing water on me in the middle of winter? That's your idea of de-escalation?" Hartley shot her a glare, his fists clenching. "You were being difficult, refusing to comply. I had to do something to get you to cooperate." Brooks stepped forward, his presence commanding, and placed himself between Hartley and Maria. "Enough," he said sharply, his voice slicing through the rising tension. "Your actions are completely unjustifiable, Officer Hartley. You've crossed the line in more ways than one." Hartley opened his mouth to retort, but was silenced by the sudden click of a camera. Simmons had pulled out a small camera and was taking photos of the scene. Maria's drenched coat, the puddle of water at her feet, the incriminating bottle of water in the car. Each snapshot was another nail in the coffin of Hartley's excuses. Maria crossed her arms, her trembling hands hidden beneath the folds of her coat. Her voice, though quiet, carried the weight of conviction. "This isn't the first time, is it, Officer Hartley? You've done things like this before, haven't you? You're just not used to someone holding you accountable." Hartley's face twisted in anger, but he didn't respond. He didn't have to. His silence spoke louder than any denial could. Brooks exchanged a glance with Simmons, and the two agents seemed to come to an unspoken agreement. "Ms. Hendricks," Brooks said, turning to face her, "we'll be taking your statement formally. For now, you should know that everything you've described aligns with what we're observing here. Officer Hartley's actions tonight will be thoroughly investigated." Maria nodded, though her eyes remained fixed on Hartley. "Good," she said simply, her voice steady despite the chill seeping into her bones. But the night wasn't done testing her, or Hartley. As Brooks stepped back toward the SUV to retrieve additional equipment, Hartley's frustration boiled over. He took a single step forward, his voice a venomous snarl. "You think you've won, don't you?" he spat at Maria. "You think this is over?" Maria didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on, her expression unwavering. "It's over for you, Hartley. You just don't realize it yet." His face contorted with rage, and for a moment it seemed as though he might lash out. His hand hovered dangerously close to his belt, where his baton and other tools of authority rested. But before he could act, Simmons stepped between them, his body language calm but firm, a clear barrier. "Officer Hartley," Simmons said, his voice low and measured, "I suggest you step back. You're only making this worse for yourself." Hartley hesitated, his face a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, and humiliation, all vying for dominance. Finally, he stepped back, though his glare at Maria remained venomous. She didn't look away, her strength an unspoken challenge to his crumbling authority. Brooks returned with a clipboard and a recording device, signaling the next phase of their investigation. "Ms. Hendricks, we'll begin recording your statement now. Please recount everything from the moment Officer Hartley approached you." Maria took a deep breath, her words steady as she began to relay the events of the night. Hartley stood off to the side, his face pale and his fists clenched, forced to listen as his actions were laid bare in excruciating detail. Every word Maria spoke was a blow to his carefully constructed facade of authority. As she finished her statement, Brooks nodded, his expression grim but resolute. "Thank you, Ms. Hendricks. This will be added to our report, along with the evidence we've gathered tonight." Hartley finally snapped. "This is ridiculous," he shouted, his voice cracking. "I was doing my job. She's blowing this way out of proportion." Brooks turned to face him, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Hartley's outburst. "Your job, Officer Hartley, is to serve and protect, not to humiliate and intimidate. What you did tonight was not only unprofessional, but criminal. You'll have your chance to explain yourself during the investigation." Hartley's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his actions beginning to sink in. He didn't respond, his mouth opening and closing as though searching for words that wouldn't come. Maria watched him silently, her expression unreadable. She didn't feel triumph, only a quiet sense of vindication. The wheels of justice had begun to turn, and while she knew the road ahead would be long, she also knew she had taken the first step toward holding men like Hartley accountable. As the agents began wrapping up their initial investigation, the freezing wind swirled around her, but Maria stood tall, her presence a testament to her resilience in the face of adversity. As the bitter cold of the night persisted, Maria's resolve stood firm despite her soaked and freezing condition. The agents from Internal Affairs had gathered all preliminary evidence, but the tension between Maria and Hartley remained thick in the air. The confrontation had escalated far beyond a simple report of misconduct. Hartley's fury simmered just beneath the surface, but Maria's quiet defiance left him unable to regain any semblance of control. He was a man cornered by his own actions, and Maria could see it in the way his fists clenched and his jaw tightened every time she met his gaze. Agent Brooks moved toward his vehicle, signaling Simmons to follow, but not before turning back to Hartley. "Officer Hartley, remain here until we've completed our next steps. You are not to leave this area without explicit instruction from us. Do I make myself clear?" Hartley nodded begrudgingly, muttering something under his breath that neither agent nor Maria could fully make out. He retreated a few steps toward his patrol car, though his posture remained rigid and tense. Maria didn't take her eyes off him. Every instinct in her told her that Hartley was not the type to back down gracefully. He would look for a way out, some means to save face or shift the blame, and she wasn't wrong. As Brooks and Simmons stepped aside to consult one another, Maria noticed Hartley's hand subtly reaching for the radio clipped to his vest. Her sharp eyes caught the movement immediately. He was trying to call for reinforcements, likely to spin a narrative in his favor before things spiraled completely out of his control. Without hesitation, Maria's voice cut through the cold air like a blade. "Agents, I believe Officer Hartley is attempting to interfere with your investigation." Both men turned sharply, their gazes locking onto Hartley, whose hand froze mid-reach. The officer glared at Maria, his face a mask of poorly concealed rage. Brooks stepped forward, his tone firm and unyielding. "Hartley, I warned you about interfering. Drop the radio, now." Hartley hesitated, his fingers twitching as if debating whether to obey or escalate. After a long, tense moment, he lowered his hand and gritted his teeth. "I was just checking in," he said defensively, though his tone betrayed his guilt. Brooks wasn't having it. "Don't insult our intelligence. One more move like that, and we'll have no choice but to detain you." Maria stood silently, her breath visible in the icy air, but her expression unflinching. She knew she was winning this battle, but she also knew Hartley wasn't done trying to salvage what little power he had left. Men like him rarely accepted defeat without a fight. It was then that another vehicle approached from the far end of the street, its headlights cutting through the swirling snow. Maria's heart quickened slightly, unsure of what to expect, but as the car drew closer, she recognized the familiar black sedan. Relief washed over her as it came to a stop a few yards away. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a man in a tailored overcoat, his expression one of calm authority. His name was Lawrence Graves, a senior official in the city's Civilian Oversight Board. Maria had worked with him before on projects aimed at improving police accountability, and his presence here was no coincidence. It seemed her earlier call had set more wheels in motion than even she anticipated. Graves walked toward the group with measured steps, his polished shoes crunching softly against the snow. He nodded briefly to Brooks and Simmons before turning his attention to Maria. "Ms. Hendricks," he said warmly, though his tone carried an undertone of concern. "I came as soon as I received your message. Are you all right?" Maria nodded, though the exhaustion in her voice was evident. "I'll be fine, but this situation needs to be addressed immediately. Officer Hartley's actions tonight are just the tip of the iceberg." Graves's expression hardened as he turned his attention to Hartley, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of the man's gaze. "Officer Hartley," Graves said, his tone sharp but measured, "you are now under direct scrutiny from the Oversight Board. Any further attempts to obstruct this investigation will result in immediate suspension and possible criminal charges. Do you understand?" Hartley's lips pressed into a thin line, but he nodded stiffly, clearly realizing that his options were dwindling. He remained silent, his gaze fixed on the ground, but Maria could see the anger simmering just beneath the surface. She knew this wasn't over, not yet. Graves turned back to Brooks. "I trust you've begun collecting all necessary evidence." Brooks nodded. "Yes, sir. We've documented the scene and taken Ms. Hendricks's statement. The next step will be to formally detain Officer Hartley for questioning." Maria's head snapped toward Brooks, her voice cutting through the cold air. "Detain him," she repeated, her tone incredulous. "That's not enough. This man poured ice water on me in freezing weather, physically intimidated me, and only stopped when you intervened. What about the other complaints against him? You and I both know this isn't an isolated incident." Graves raised a hand, signaling for calm. "Maria, trust me. This is only the beginning. We need to build an airtight case, one that leaves no room for doubt. If we act too hastily, there's a risk he'll walk away with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. We can't let that happen." Maria's frustration was evident, but she took a deep breath and nodded reluctantly. She hated the idea of waiting, of allowing Hartley even a sliver of hope that he could escape accountability. But she understood the importance of strategy. This wasn't just about her, it was about every person Hartley had wronged, every life he had disrupted with his abuse of power. And she wasn't about to let him get away with it. As the agents prepared to place Hartley in the back of their vehicle, the officer finally snapped. "This is a damn witch hunt," he shouted, his voice echoing through the empty street. "You're all out to get me because of one lousy mistake. You think you're heroes. You think she's some kind of victim. She's just playing the system." The outburst was met with silence, save for the faint sound of wind howling through the alleyways. Maria didn't flinch. She simply stared at Hartley, her expression one of quiet resolve. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but laced with steel. The system you're talking about? It's designed to protect people like you, Hartley. That's why you've been able to get away with this for so long, but not anymore. Tonight the system is going to do what it should have done years ago, hold you accountable. Hartley glared at her, his chest heaving with barely contained rage, but he said nothing more. Brooks and Simmons escorted him to their vehicle, his protests fading into the background as the door slammed shut behind him. The once dominant figure now looked small and powerless, his bravado shattered by the weight of his own actions. As the agents prepared to leave with Hartley in custody, Graves turned back to Maria. "We'll take it from here," he assured her, "but I'll need your continued cooperation as this case unfolds. Your testimony will be crucial." Maria nodded. "You'll have it. Just make sure this doesn't get swept under the rug." Graves offered her a small but genuine smile. "It won't. You have my word." With that, the vehicles pulled away, their taillights disappearing into the snowy night. Maria stood alone for a moment, the quiet returning to the street. The cold seemed sharper now, biting at her skin as the adrenaline began to fade. But she didn't feel defeated. She felt vindicated. The wheels of justice had been set in motion, and while the road ahead would be long, she was ready for the fight. This was bigger than her. It was about dismantling a system that allowed men like Hartley to thrive. And Maria Hendricks wasn't one to back down from a challenge. Not now, not ever. The biting cold seemed to intensify as the minutes dragged on. The streetlights flickered faintly, their beams barely cutting through the dense snowfall that had begun to pick up again. Maria stood in the same spot, the damp chill of her soaked clothes clinging to her skin, but she barely felt it anymore. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the evening, but not in doubt or fear. She was calculating. Every move Hartley had made, every word he had said, was etched into her memory like a battle map. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. Men like Hartley didn't just roll over and accept defeat. They fought back, often viciously, clawing at any thread of power they could still grasp. And tonight, Hartley was cornered. The unmarked SUV carrying Hartley disappeared down the snowy road, leaving Maria alone with Lawrence Graves, the senior official from the Oversight board. The faint sound of the vehicle's tires crunching against the snow faded into the distance, and for a moment the street was eerily silent. Graves adjusted his coat, stepping closer to Maria. His expression was calm, but she could see the concern etched in the lines of his face. "You've been through a lot tonight," Graves said, his voice steady but soft. "We'll make sure Hartley is held accountable. I give you my word." Maria nodded, but her gaze remained fixed on the spot where Hartley had stood just minutes earlier. "I don't want promises," she said quietly. "I want results. I want to know that men like him won't keep walking away from this kind of behavior. This isn't just about me, Lawrence. You know that." Graves sighed, his breath visible in the cold air. "You're right. This goes deeper than one bad cop. But we have to be careful. Hartley's not just a loose cannon, he's a symptom of a much larger problem. And larger problems take time to dismantle." Maria turned to face him, her eyes sharp. "Time is a luxury we don't have. Every day men like him stay on the force, someone else gets hurt, someone else loses their dignity, their trust, or worse, their life. How many more times are we going to say be patient before something actually changes?" Graves met her gaze, his expression softening. "I hear you, Maria, and I promise you we're doing everything we can." Before she could respond, the distant sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. Another car, this one marked as a patrol cruiser, came into view, its red and blue lights flashing against the swirling snow. Maria's stomach tightened. She wasn't expecting anyone else to arrive, and something about the timing felt off. As the cruiser pulled to a stop a few feet away, two uniformed officers stepped out, their faces stern and unreadable. "Ms. Hendricks," one of them called, his tone professional but cold. Maria straightened, pulling her damp coat tighter around her shoulders. "Yes? We need you to come with us," the officer said, his eyes scanning her from head to toe, lingering just a little too long on her disheveled appearance. "We have some questions about the incident tonight." Graves stepped forward, his voice firm. "This is unnecessary. Ms. Hendricks has already given her statement to Internal Affairs, and she's not required to answer any additional questions without proper notice." The officer's gaze shifted to Graves, his expression hardening. With all due respect, sir, this is an ongoing investigation. We've been instructed to bring her in for further questioning. Maria's heart sank as she realized what was happening. This wasn't a routine follow-up. This was retaliation. Hartley had managed to pull some strings before being taken into custody, likely contacting allies within the department to create more trouble for her. It was a classic move: shift the focus, muddy the waters, and make the accuser look like the problem. She had seen it happen too many times before. Graves stepped closer to the officers, his posture tense. "Who gave you these instructions?" he demanded. The second officer, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. "We're just following orders, sir. If Ms. Hendricks has nothing to hide, she won't mind coming with us." Maria felt a spark of anger flare in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I've already told you everything you need to know," she said, her voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere unless you can give me a legitimate reason for this." The first officer's lips curled into a faint smirk, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Resisting a lawful request doesn't look good, Ms. Hendricks. We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Graves stepped between them, his voice sharp. "That's enough. If you insist on pursuing this, you'd better be prepared to explain yourselves to internal affairs. This looks an awful lot like intimidation." The officers exchanged a glance, their confidence wavering for a brief moment. But the first officer quickly recovered, his smirk returning. "We're just doing our job, sir. If there's been a misunderstanding, Ms. Hendricks can clear it up back at the station." Maria took a deep breath, her mind racing. She knew they were baiting her, trying to provoke a reaction that they could use against her. She also knew that refusing outright could escalate the situation further. After a moment, she turned to Graves. "It's fine," she said quietly. "I'll go. But I want you to stay here and document everything. Make sure this doesn't disappear into the system." Graves hesitated, his expression conflicted. "Maria, you don't have to do this." She gave him a small, determined smile. "I know, but I need them to know I'm not afraid of their games." With that, she stepped forward, her chin held high, and allowed the officers to lead her to the cruiser. They didn't cuff her, but the way they flanked her on either side felt like a deliberate attempt to create the illusion of guilt. As she slid into the back seat, the cold leather of the seat pressing against her damp clothes, Maria clenched her fists tightly in her lap. She refused to let them see even a hint of vulnerability. The drive to the station was silent, save for the occasional crackle of the radio. The officers didn't speak to her, their eyes fixed on the road ahead. Maria stared out the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of white and grey. She couldn't help but wonder how many others had been in this exact position, taken in not because they had done anything wrong, but because they dared to challenge the system. When they arrived at the station, Maria was led through the dimly lit halls to a small interrogation room. The air inside was stale, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow over the metal table and chairs. One of the officers gestured for her to sit, his smirk never leaving his face. "Make yourself comfortable," he said, his tone dripping with mock politeness. "Someone will be with you shortly." Maria sat down, her back straight and her gaze unwavering. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of looking defeated. The door closed with a soft click, leaving her alone in the room. She took a deep breath, centering herself. This was exactly what she had expected, an attempt to rattle her, to make her feel small and powerless. But she wasn't going to break, not here, not now. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as she waited, the silence pressing down on her like a weight. Finally, the door opened, and a man in a suit stepped inside. He was older, with greying hair and a face lined with years of experience, or perhaps cynicism. He carried a file in one hand, which he set down on the table before taking a seat across from her. "Ms. Hendricks," he began, his voice calm but distant. "Thank you for agreeing to come in. I'm Detective Martin, and I just have a few follow-up questions for you." Maria didn't respond immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly. She could sense the calculated nature of his approach, the way he carefully chose his words to project neutrality. But she wasn't fooled. "Follow-up questions?" she said finally, her tone steady. "About what exactly?" "I've already given my statement to Internal Affairs." Martin leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him. "I understand that, but there are a few inconsistencies we'd like to clarify. For example, Officer Hartley has alleged that you acted aggressively during your interaction with him." He claims you refused to comply with his instructions and escalated the situation unnecessarily. Maria felt a surge of anger but kept her expression composed. Is that so? She said evenly. And did he mention that he poured freezing water on me? Or that he physically intimidated me? Martin didn't flinch, his expression remaining neutral. Those details are part of the ongoing investigation. I'm just here to gather additional context. Maria leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on his. Detective Martin, let me be clear. I know exactly what this is. It's a distraction, an attempt to discredit me and shift the focus away from Hartley's actions. But it's not going to work. For the first time, Martin's facade cracked ever so slightly. A flicker of uncertainty passed over his face before he quickly recovered. Ms. Hendricks, we're just trying to get to the truth. Maria sat back, her confidence unwavering. Good. Then I suggest you start by looking at the evidence instead of wasting time trying to intimidate me. The room fell silent, the weight of her words hanging in the air. Martin stared at her for a long moment before finally nodding. Noted. As he gathered his file and left the room, Maria exhaled slowly. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going down without a fight. The room was heavy with silence after Detective Martin left, but Maria Hendricks felt no relief. She had stared him down, dismantling his feigned neutrality with calm precision, but the walls of the police station seemed to close in around her. She remained seated at the metal table, the cold from her damp clothes seeping into her bones. This wasn't about fear. She was long past that. It was about patience. She had no choice but to wait for the next move, to endure whatever tactics they might try to unsettle her. Men like Hartley and systems built to protect them didn't go down without a fight. She knew that all too well. Maria glanced at the clock on the wall. Time dragged painfully, every second feeling like an hour. Her mind raced through the events of the night, cataloguing every detail she had shared, every word Hartley had spewed in his self-righteous anger. This was a carefully orchestrated game on their part, stalling tactics, intimidation, an attempt to cast doubt on her credibility. But she refused to let the frustration show. She needed to remain in control, not just of her emotions, but of the entire narrative they were trying to twist. Suddenly, the door opened again. This time, two men entered, both wearing plain suits. Their demeanor was different from Martin's. They weren't trying to look neutral or calm, they exuded authority in the way that only seasoned officers could, an air of untouchability, as though they were the arbiters of truth in the room. The taller of the two, a man with sharp features and cold eyes, spoke first. "Ms. Hendricks, I'm Captain Rhodes. This is Lieutenant Davis," he said, gesturing to his shorter, stockier companion. "We're here to resolve this situation once and for all. I trust you'll cooperate." Maria tilted her head slightly, her expression impassive. "I've already cooperated," she said evenly. "And as I've told everyone else, there's nothing more to clarify. The facts speak for themselves." Rhodes exchanged a glance with Davis, who pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "Hartley's version of events paints a different picture," Davis began, his tone clipped. "According to him, you resisted lawful orders, acted aggressively, and escalated the situation unnecessarily. He also claims that the water was an accident and that your account is exaggerated." Maria's lips twitched into a faint, humorless smile. "Of course he does. That's what men like him always do. Rewrite the story to make themselves the victim." Rhodes leaned forward, his hands resting on the table. "Ms. Hendricks, I suggest you take this seriously. If we find inconsistencies in your account, it could complicate things for you. You don't want that." Maria's gaze hardened. "Are you threatening me, Captain Rhodes? Because it sounds an awful lot like you're trying to intimidate me into silence." Rhodes straightened, his jaw tightening. "No one's threatening you, but we need to ensure we have the full picture before any further action is taken." Maria didn't blink. "Then maybe you should focus on Hartley instead of me. Or better yet, review the evidence collected by Internal Affairs. There are eyewitnesses, and I'm sure the cameras on the street will confirm every word I've said. You know, if you're actually interested in the truth." Davis shifted uncomfortably, but Rhodes didn't flinch. "The truth is what we're after," he said coolly. "But until this investigation is complete, we have to consider all possibilities." Maria leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Consider this, Captain. Hartley poured freezing water on me, physically intimidated me, and abused his authority. That's not a possibility. That's a fact. And every minute you spend trying to undermine me instead of addressing his actions only makes you complicit." The room went quiet. Davis glanced at Rhodes again, but this time there was something unspoken in their exchange, an acknowledgement that they were losing control of the conversation. Before Rhodes could respond, the door swung open abruptly, and in walked Lawrence Graves, flanked by Special Agent Brooks from Internal Affairs. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately. Rhodes and Davis stiffened, their postures becoming defensive. "Gentlemen," Graves said sharply, his voice slicing through the tension like a blade, "this conversation is over." Rhodes frowned, clearly displeased. "Graves, this is still a departmental matter. We're handling it." Graves stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Not anymore, you're not. Internal Affairs has jurisdiction now, and any further attempts to interfere will be reported directly to the Commissioner. Is that clear?" Rhodes's face darkened, but he nodded curtly. "Crystal." Graves turned to Maria, his expression softening slightly. "Ms. Hendricks, are you all right?" Maria nodded. "I'm fine, but I'd prefer not to spend another minute in this room." Graves gestured toward the door. "You're free to go. We'll escort you out." As Maria stood, she caught a glimpse of the frustration on Rhodes's face. It was the look of a man who had just lost control of a situation he thought he could manipulate. She didn't say anything, but the quiet satisfaction in her eyes spoke volumes. Brooks led the way as they exited the station, Graves walking alongside Maria. The cold night air hit her as soon as they stepped outside, but this time it felt different. It wasn't oppressive or suffocating, it was liberating. The snow was still falling, the streetlights casting a soft glow over the quiet street. Maria took a deep breath, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. "I'm sorry you had to endure that," Graves said, his voice low. "They were clearly trying to intimidate you." Maria glanced at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "It didn't work." Graves chuckled softly. "I didn't think it would. But still, it shouldn't have happened. We'll be filing formal complaints against everyone involved." They stopped near the black SUV that had brought Graves to the station. Brooks turned to Maria, his expression serious. "Hartley is in custody, and the evidence we've gathered is damning. He won't be getting away with this." Maria nodded, though her eyes remained on the snow-covered street. "It's not just about Hartley. You know that, right? He's part of something much bigger. If we don't address the system that allows men like him to thrive, this will keep happening." Graves placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "One step at a time, Maria. Tonight we've taken the first step." Maria met his gaze, her expression resolute. "Then let's make sure it's not the last." As the SUV pulled away, Maria stood on the quiet street for a moment, watching the taillights disappear into the distance. The cold still nipped at her skin, but it no longer felt overwhelming. She had faced the storm head-on and come out stronger. This wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. Hartley's fall would be the first crack in the foundation of a system that had stood unchallenged for far too long. And Maria Hendricks was ready to see it all come crashing down. The air was crisp and cold the morning after the events that had unraveled the night before, but for Maria Hendricks, there was a sense of clarity cutting through the frosty atmosphere. As she stood by her apartment window, a steaming cup of tea in her hands, she reflected on the confrontation with Officer Hartley and the relentless web of intimidation she had endured. It wasn't just about what had happened to her, it never was. Hartley was one man in a system that had protected him and men like him for far too long. But for the first time, it felt like the tides were shifting. Last night had not been an ending, it was a beginning. And Maria had no intention of letting the momentum fade. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was Lawrence Graves. She picked up, his familiar, steady voice greeting her. "Maria, I thought you'd want to hear this directly. Hartley's case is officially moving forward. Internal Affairs is filing charges for misconduct, excessive force, and abuse of authority." Maria allowed herself a small breath of relief. "That's a start," she said, though her voice remained cautious. "What about the precinct? Are they going to address the way they handled things after the fact? The intimidation? The threats?" There was a pause on the line before Graves spoke again. "It's already being escalated. The Commissioner has called for an emergency review of the precinct's leadership and Rhodes and Davis are being investigated for obstruction. They overstepped, and it's not going unnoticed. Maria's grip on the phone tightened. She had expected some level of accountability, but hearing it confirmed stirred something deeper. A sense that her fight was finally making cracks in the armor of a system she had long thought impenetrable. "Good," she said finally, "but we can't let it stop there. This has to mean more than just punishing a few bad actors." Graves chuckled softly. "I had a feeling you'd say that. There's a meeting scheduled for tomorrow with the commissioner, the mayor, and a few key members of the Oversight board. They've asked if you'd be willing to attend. They want to hear your perspective firsthand." Maria raised an eyebrow, her mind already racing. "They're asking me to speak." "They are," Graves confirmed. "And frankly, Maria, you're exactly who they need to hear from. Last night wasn't just about Hartley. It's about changing the way this city approaches policing. You've been at the forefront of these issues for years, and now you have the platform to make real change." She didn't respond immediately, the weight of the invitation settling over her. This wasn't just an opportunity, it was a responsibility. "I'll be there," she said finally, her voice firm. The call ended, and Maria placed the phone back on the counter, her mind already shifting to the task ahead. This wasn't just about recounting her experience, it was about framing it within the broader context of systemic failures and pushing for reforms that went beyond surface-level fixes. She knew it wouldn't be easy, change never was. But she was ready for the fight. The following day, Maria walked into City Hall with her head held high. The grand building, with its marble floors and towering columns, was bustling with activity as city officials, reporters, and community leaders prepared for the meeting. Maria could feel the eyes on her as she entered the main hall, some curious, others wary. She wasn't just a participant in this discussion, she was the catalyst. Her presence alone challenged the status quo, and she intended to make every moment count. Inside the conference room, the atmosphere was tense but purposeful. The commissioner, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern expression, sat at the head of the table, flanked by the mayor and several high-ranking officials. Lawrence Graves was there as well, offering her a small nod of encouragement as she took her seat. The commissioner began the meeting with a measured tone. "Thank you all for being here today. Recent events have brought to light serious issues within our police force that can no longer be ignored. Ms. Hendricks, we've reviewed the details of your case and the preliminary findings from internal affairs. I want to start by acknowledging the courage it took for you to stand up and push back against an abuse of power. Your actions have already set change in motion." Maria met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Thank you, Commissioner, but courage shouldn't be a prerequisite for accountability. No one should have to endure what I did just to be treated with basic respect and dignity." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The room shifted uncomfortably as the weight of her statement settled over them. The mayor, a woman with sharp features and an air of determination, leaned forward. "Ms. Hendricks, we're committed to addressing these issues, but we need your insight. What do you believe needs to change, not just in this precinct, but across the city?" Maria took a deep breath, her hands resting firmly on the table. "It starts with accountability," she said. "Officers like Hartley have been protected for too long by a system that prioritizes loyalty over justice. Internal investigations need to be independent and transparent, with civilian oversight to ensure impartiality. But it's not just about punishing bad officers. We need to change the culture of policing, eliminate the US versus them mentality that fuels aggression and bias." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the room. Training needs to be overhauled to emphasize de-escalation, empathy, and community engagement. And there needs to be real consequences for officers who abuse their power. Not a slap on the wrist, not administrative leave, real accountability that sends a message. The commissioner nodded thoughtfully. "Those are all valid points, and they align with some of the initiatives we've been discussing internally. But change takes time, Ms. Hendricks. How do we ensure that these measures are effective in the long term?" Maria's eyes sharpened. "By listening to the communities you serve. Too often, decisions are made in rooms like this without input from the people who are most affected. If you want lasting change, you need to involve them in the process. Hold public forums, establish advisory boards with real power. Make the people part of the solution." The room fell silent again, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone present. Graves broke the silence, his voice steady. Maria's right. This isn't just about policy, it's about trust. And right now, trust between the police and the community is fractured. Rebuilding that trust will take more than words. It will take action. The mayor nodded, her expression resolute. Then that's what we'll do. I'll draft an executive order to establish a civilian oversight committee with full authority to review police misconduct cases. And we'll allocate funding for expanded training programs and community outreach initiatives. Maria allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't everything, but it was a start. A foundation to build on. As the meeting continued, the discussion turned to logistics and timelines, but Maria's mind was already looking ahead. This was just the first battle in a much larger war. She knew there would be resistance, both from within the force and from those who benefited from maintaining the status quo. But she also knew she wasn't alone. The events of the past few days had shown her that change was possible, even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the meeting adjourned, the commissioner approached her, his expression earnest. "Thank you for speaking so candidly, Ms. Hendricks. Your input has been invaluable." Maria nodded, her voice calm but firm. "Don't just thank me. Prove that this matters. Prove that you're willing to do the work." He met her gaze, a flicker of determination in his eyes. "We will." As Maria left City Hall, the cold winter air greeted her once again, but this time it felt invigorating. She had faced the storm and emerged stronger. Hartley's actions had been the spark, but the fire of change was just beginning to burn, and Maria Hendricks was ready to fan the flames. This wasn't just her fight, it was a fight for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or dehumanized. And she would see it through to the end.